In the thick silence before dawn on the 24th of March, year 1603, three figures moved quietly through the cold walls of Richmond Palace, a place cloaked in a thin layer of mist and a silence heavier than the air before a storm. As their footsteps touched the aged wooden floor without leaving a sound, as if they themselves feared awakening secrets that had slept undisturbed for 45 years beneath the reign of the woman known as the Virgin Queen, a name now on the verge of being stripped away to reveal something that none of them were truly ready to face. They were not ordinary or inexperienced people, but three individuals specifically chosen for their ability to keep secrets, their absolute loyalty to the crown, and their willingness to carry any truth to the grave without uttering a word. Because what they were about to witness was not just a medical reality, but something capable of shattering the entire myth England had built around the figure of Elizabeth Tudor, the woman who had defied the Pope, challenged Spain, and founded an era described with proud, poetic terms, while also hiding a fracture running deep through the very soul of her monarchy. The turning of the key in the lock echoed like a warning, and as the door creaked open, they entered the cold room where the body had lain for many hours, in a state the outside world believed to be peaceful rest, but was in fact a state of waiting, because no one dared to handle that corpse. Before the final witnesses, perhaps the only ones, were summoned to see with their own eyes what lay beneath the layers of cosmetics and regal garments, placed not in reverence, but in an invisible, unmistakable fear. Dr. Richard Menningham, a physician who had treated nobles afflicted with conditions too unspeakable for official medical texts, was the first to kneel beside the body, his hand, old but steady, tracing the edges of a collar studded with pearls, before slowly removing each layer of fabric, each unveiling a truth that could not be denied. The white skin beneath the dress was no longer that of the living, nor of an ordinary corpse, but something ravaged, corroded, swollen, bruised black like wet ash after fire. Its scent, a noxious blend of dried blood, poisonous dye, and something metallic that wrinkled his nose instinctively, as if her blood had turned into something that no longer belonged to the realm of the living. Lady Helena Snakenborg, the only woman present in the room, once a Swedish noble but long since resident in England, never looked away from Elizabeth's face, where waxy white makeup still clung in patchy smears, concealing ulcers that had long since begun to bleed. And when the red on her lips was wiped away, they saw the Queen's mouth devoid of teeth, only a dark hollow, where her lips had been eaten away so they could no longer close, and from which she had once issued decrees and declarations now etched into the chronicles of history, but now was merely a hole where truth had long been swallowed in silence. The third person, a nameless clergyman, selected from a remote monastery, for reasons unknown, held in his trembling hands an old Bible, his eyes fixed unblinking on the body, slowly revealing itself like a curse, finally unraveling. And he would later write in its final page, "I have seen the devil wear a crown. May God forgive us for what we have hidden." What they saw was not simply a decaying body, but a shattered symbol. A symbol of national power devoured by the very things used to construct it lead in the makeup. Mercury in the skin cream, arsenic in the rouge, and the tightly laced corsets that deformed her ribs, pushed her liver upward, compressed her lungs to the size of an apple, and shriveled the womb into something like a dried plum, while the skin fused to the fabric as if time and deception had together bonded flesh and power into a single, agonized whole. When the final corset was removed, Dr. Manningham paused for a long while, for the spine along the Queen's back revealed small, bony protrusions. He described them as like horns jutting from each vertebra, covered in rough skin like fish scales, something he had never seen in any creature on earth. And from that moment he no longer recorded the name Elizabeth, but Creatura, Regina, the royal creature, as if the thing lying before him had transcended all definitions of woman, human, or creation itself. After more than 3 hours in that chamber, with candles burning throughout, yet unable to warm the air chilled by the presence of truth itself. They stood in silence. No words exchanged. Because none were needed, they all understood that what they had just witnessed must never leave that room, and that Elizabeth Tudor's remains would need to be sealed not just with lead, but with silence. And that silence would endure for over 4 centuries. But before the body was placed in its lead-lined coffin, one final act was carried out, not by the physician, nor by any servant, but by Lady Snakenborg herself, who quietly withdrew from her sleeve a strip of white silk, gently wrapped it around the Queen's eyes, still open, still locked in the same cold gaze they had held in life, and whispered a sentence no one else heard, except perhaps the body itself, a final word for a queen whose soul, it seemed, had never truly rested. No one truly knows whether Elizabeth ever looked upon her real face in the final years of her life. For among the few scattered records left behind by her closest attendants, one strange command appears again and again. Like sacred law, all mirrors within the palace were to be removed, and any reflective surface, be it polished silver, artificial ponds, or glistening marble, was to be covered with silk cloth, as if the Queen were not merely avoiding her appearance, but attempting to escape something far more terrifying than a reflection, as if every mirrored glance threatened to reveal a truth too monstrous to face. A hidden doorway into the nightmare named Elizabeth, and yet, if mirrors were banished, the eyes of others still remained, which is why the final public appearances of Queen Elizabeth became theatrical rituals, so intricate they bordered on the grotesque, each outing a ceremony that lasted for hours, during which she was bathed in herbs to suppress the stench of decaying flesh. Coated in layers of white lead makeup, thick as mortar, crowned with human hair wigs, soaked in chemical treatments, and dressed in specially tailored gowns designed to conceal the distortions of her body, where portions had swollen, festered, or oozed to such a degree that absorbent padding had to be sewn discreetly into the lining, all orchestrated to conjure the illusion of a timeless monarch, while in truth her body was dying by degrees. A cadaver kept upright by the machinery of state and the fear of the court. Beneath those magnificent gowns, her body was a map of voluntary torture, a topography of ruin shaped by decades of tight lacing until bones cracked, the makeup laced with lead until skin turned to rot, belladonna eye drops until blindness set in, and tonics infused with secret ingredients that charlatans claimed would preserve youth, but which in reality turned her blood into something black and viscous as tar, so that each time a needle pierced her flesh to draw out what doctors called melancholic humours, the attending physician recoiled as the blood frothed, shimmered with metallic glint, and at times even seemed to ripple as though it were alive. Her internal organs, later described from the memory of Dr. Profligate Manningham, formed a grotesque harmony of mutation and collapse, the liver swollen yet displaced beneath her ribs, the small intestines shriveled like threads, the womb shapeless and completely sealed by ancient scar tissue to the point where he could not determine if it had ever functioned. And between these necrotic tissues were shattered, remnants of bone ribs that had broken long ago and were never allowed to heal, instead fused back into the body through the relentless pressure of corsets, until it seemed her own skeleton had begun to cannibalize itself to maintain the outward form. There is no official record of the pain she endured, but in the rare letters exchanged between her handmaidens, a few scattered lines hint at an unspeakable torment that the Queen would sometimes sit motionless for 4 hours at a time, her eyes unblinking, her lips unmoving, her forehead sweating, while her body remained cold as stone. And only after scented oils were pressed into her temples and quiet prayers murmured beside her ear would she stir again, as if her soul had wandered beyond her flesh and could only be summoned back through silent rites known only to the frightened few who served her. As her life neared its end, Elizabeth grew increasingly strange. She refused food, and when she did eat, she vomited blood. She spoke to empty spaces, calling out to her mother who had been dead since Elizabeth was a toddler. She startled at wind, wept a bit, and at times whispered that she was not truly human, a statement no one understood at the time, but which, in light of the autopsy, became a chilling omen. For the body they examined was not merely that of a poisoned woman, but of a being malformed by illness, secrecy, and decades of political sculpting into something unrecognizable. And all of this was ultimately entombed beneath that final layer of lead, not only the substance applied to her face, but the same element that would line her coffin, as though it were not just burial but containment, not just preservation but suppression, a metallic armor designed to protect the world from the truth festering inside. Because perhaps Elizabeth herself had come to understand that if her body were ever revealed, her entire reign would collapse, not through war or rebellion, but through revulsion. It was in the waning winter of the year 1602 that the Queen's body began to betray her with such intensity that even her most loyal attendants, trained for silence and submission, could no longer contain their terror behind the rigid masks of duty. For in those final months, the palace ceased to be a place of power and became instead a sanctuary of rot, a mausoleum that breathed, where servants passed one another in the corridors without speaking, eyes cast downward, not from reverence, but from fear of what they might see or smell, should they glance too closely into the chambers where England's longest reigning monarch was quietly, horrifically, coming undone. The physicians, chosen not for their competence but their discretion, recorded their findings in cryptic Latin, their notes less a medical chart than a catalogue of unholy phenomena, where symptoms no longer aligned with any known ailment, but with fables whispered in the margins of theology, things that priests rebuked, that monks burned, that witches were accused of conjuring. They described ulcers on her legs that festered with such stench that herbs had to be burned around the clock. Yet the smell persisted, sour and metallic, clinging to tapestries and robes, seeping into the stone until even the walls seemed to weep with it. One surgeon wrote, in a passage later redacted by royal archivists, that when lancing one such ulcer, he was met not with pus or blood, but with a fluid black as tar, hot to the touch, that hissed when exposed to air, and smelled not of flesh, but of something far older, something elemental and wrong, like rusted iron buried too long beneath poisoned soil, and when the blood spilled onto his silver instrument, it stained the metal permanently, etching patterns that resembled symbols, circles, thorns, crooked stars, that none could identify but which made the priest in the room turn pale and reach instinctively for his crucifix. These fluids thick, trawling, unclean, did not clot, did not follow gravity, did not obey the principles of anatomy, and in some moments seemed to move of their own volition, as if driven by a will distinct from the body that birthed them. And it was then that the whisper began to circulate in corners of the palace, no longer swept by servants or guarded by courtiers, that Elizabeth was no longer merely ill, nor simply cursed, but becoming something else entirely, something unbound from the laws of nature, something neither living nor dead, but suspended in a state of perpetual violation, her flesh not decaying in the usual way, but unraveling like a corrupted manuscript, whose ink had begun to bleed beyond the parchment, and there were the fits unspeakable, sudden seizures in which her limbs twisted into impossible configurations, her jaw locking, her eyes rolling back into sockets darkened with veins, her voice reduced to gasps and fragments of Latin, Greek, and sometimes languages unknown to even the most learned scribes, who dared not write them down for fear of invoking what they might name. Her ladies-in-waiting were instructed to stuff linen into her mouth when the fits began, not to protect her tongue but to muffle the noises, which in their rawest, most panicked moments they described as the howls of things without form. She spoke, at times, to beings no one could see reaching toward corners of the room where shadows pooled unnaturally. Addressing her mother, Anna Boleyn, as if she was sitting in the corner in full French gown, or calling out to her childhood nurse, long dead, with tears streaming down her ruined face, which even layers of makeup could no longer conceal. And on one unforgettable occasion, she turned to a mirror she had ordered destroyed years prior, catching sight of herself in the reflection of a polished goblet, and shrieked not in fear but in recognition, as if she had just been confronted not by her image, but by something that had followed her for decades, and had now finally caught up. The Privy Council, now entirely made up of men who had grown old under her reign and owed their entire careers to her illusion of invincibility. They made a desperate decision in the final winter of her life. They commissioned doubles, women of similar stature and carriage, to appear in her place when her state was too ghastly to be hidden with artifice. These women were painted, dressed, and presented at a distance to foreign ambassadors and visiting nobles. Their appearances orchestrated with military precision, their words scripted, their gestures memorized, while the real Elizabeth remained cloistered behind thick velvet curtains, twitching beneath her embroidered sheets, her body festooned with bandages, poultices, and strips of linen soaked in herbs and honey, though none could mask the truth that beneath all the gold thread and prayers, she was unraveling like a candle burned from the inside out. It was during this time that the palace itself began to change. For buildings, like people, absorb the vibrations of those who suffer within them, and those who passed through Richmond reported feeling as though the air itself was weighted, as though the walls pressed inward, as though the Queen's agony had seeped into the very mortar. Priests began to report hearing murmurs in the chapel, words not spoken but breathed, syllables too soft to trace yet impossible to ignore, and more than one chambermaid fled her post in tears, swearing she had seen something move beneath the Queen's bed, though nothing had stirred. And then came the final sign, the one no one could deny, no matter how well trained or well bribed. For one cold night in February, a physician opened a vein in the Queen's arm, and what poured forth was not blood, not even the black ichor they had grown accustomed to, but something thick, pulsing, alive with glittering threads that coiled around the basin and hissed when touched with silver. And it was then that the minister who had remained silent through every other indignity whispered, "This is no longer human. God has left this room." They sealed that basin in lead and buried it in the chapel floor without ceremony. The following morning, Elizabeth refused to speak, refused to eat, refused to sit or lie down, declaring that to yield to gravity was to yield to death. And so she stood for nearly 20 hours, eyes wide, breath shallow, hair matted beneath her crown, that her entire body trembling not from age but from some tension no one could understand, until at last she collapsed into the arms of two terrified ladies and muttered something so soft that no one could be certain what she had said, though the words repeated in whispers long after I am bound with iron. The Queen has changed. The Queen is no more. By the time the spring winds began to stir the trees along the Thames in the early days of March, year 1603, there was no longer a living monarch within Richmond Palace, not in the way the world understood life. For Elizabeth was by then little more than a vessel, something hollowed out by decades of poison, silence, and secrets so heavy they warped the very bones that bore them. And while her name still summoned courtiers to bow, and her seal still signed decrees sent across the seas, the woman who had once stared down kings and popes was now staring into shadows, conversing with ghosts, and clutching her chest where, beneath layers of lace and lead, something had begun to grow. They called it, in their cloaked Latin records, monstrum in corpore, a monster in the body, a swelling near the left breast, first noticed in late winter, that had darkened from bruise purple to black within a week, pulsing with its own rhythm, as if defying the Queen's faltering heart. And when it was finally lanced by trembling hands behind closed doors, what emerged was not pus, nor blood, nor anything that could be named without trembling, but a mixture of black fluid, clotted tissue, and what appeared to be strands of hair, tiny calcified nodules resembling teeth, and something else, a lump of flesh with the texture of skin but no clear origin, as if the Queen had begun to grow parts of herself again from the inside out, or perhaps from something that had never fully belonged to her. Some called it cancer, others, in private, invoked the name of the devil, and one man, an apothecary's assistant who briefly glimpsed the contents of the basin, refused to speak ever again, retreating to a priory where he scratched circles into the walls until his fingers bled and insisted that what he saw had eyes. The Queen's body, examined in secret hours after her final collapse, offered no comfort to those who had come seeking closure. Instead, it delivered revelation through revulsion. Beneath the final layer of cosmetic artifice, her skin had become a parchment of black veins, twisted into patterns that some believed were accidental, and others feared were deliberate sigils burned into her flesh, not by ink or blade, but by decades of lead seeping inward, like scripture written backward by time. Where the lead had eaten deepest, there were holes straight to bone. Her skull, exposed beneath the carefully arranged wig, had softened and warped, the crown of her head bearing a strange depression, not unlike the fontanelle of a newborn, but this one pulsed long after her breath had stopped, as though something within had refused to die alongside her. The corset, when finally removed, peeled away with such resistance that it tore pieces of necrotized tissue from her rib cage, revealing a thorax so deformed by 50 years of forced compression that the lower ribs had curled inward like claws, crushing the lungs, folding the stomach into a ribbon, and pushing the liver high into her chest, where it nestled behind the heart like a stowaway hiding from light. The organs, when touched, crumbled in places, not from age alone, but from chemical corrosion, their texture described not as flesh but as wax soaked in vinegar. One physician noted the smell of mercury on her breath, as if she had been inhaling alchemy with every prayer. It was the lower half of her body, however, that brought the chamber to stillness, for beneath the final folds of velvet and silk, between legs long withered by infection and immobility, there was nothing that could be explained easily. Nothing that conformed to the expectations of anatomy or gender or royal blood. What should have been female was not quite so. What should not have been there was not quite absent either. The external structure of the Queen's body presented an ambiguity so profound it could not be resolved even by those trained to name every part. The vaginal opening, if it had ever been one, it had long since sealed over with scar tissue, so old it had formed smooth, bone-like calcifications. The uterus, or what was believed to be one, had atrophied into a hardened knot, its interior lined with deposits resembling coral. There were no signs of childbirth, nor of capacity for it, and nestled within the pelvis, overlapping parts of what should have been reproductive organs, were vestiges of tissue that bore the unmistakable texture of male anatomy undeveloped, perhaps, or hidden by congenital deformity, but present in ways no royal physician dared to write plainly. One of them dropped his scalpel. Another fell to his knees and began to pray not for the Queen, but for England. This discovery was not merely physical. It was theological, political, existential. For if Elizabeth Tudor had ruled not as a woman, but as a creature between, beside, or beyond what her subjects believed her to be, then what did that mean for the laws she had passed, the wars she had waged, the throne she had secured? Could a monarch be legitimate if their very body defied the divine order? Could a woman anointed by God still wear the crown, if her flesh was neither fully woman nor fully man? And more terrifying still, had this always been known, hidden beneath the gowns and poetry and painted portraits? Or was it the result of years of chemical ritual, political corsetry, and the slow, poisonous unraveling of a body transformed into myth? Dr. Manningham, in a private journal written in cipher and buried beneath the floorboards of his study, would later write that he found not one heart, but two, one where it should be, and a second, smaller cluster of muscle near the stomach, still faintly twitching hours after death. He wrote of lung tissue in the abdomen, bone where none should exist, and a brain that, when examined through a discreet incision, revealed hard, pearl-like nodules embedded like seeds inside rotted fruit. When sliced open, they oozed a pale fluid with a scent like burned oil and candle wax, and the silver instruments used to probe them turned black upon contact. And so the final consensus was not spoken aloud, but etched into silence, a silence that would be reinforced with lead, with lore, with legend. The corpse was not laid in state. No death mask was taken. No public vigil was permitted. Instead, Elizabeth was wrapped in layers of linen and then bound in a lead coffin, which itself was sealed within a second casket, lined with mercury and engraved with symbols that no one could explain. Their meaning long lost to time or intentionally obscured, chains were wrapped around both coffins, not to protect the body from disturbance, but to ensure it never rose again. And when the tomb was lowered into the abbey, a stone was set above her bearing, not a likeness, but a title, Virgin Queen, a phrase that now rang hollow, or perhaps truer than anyone dared admit. For what lay beneath it was not a queen, nor a virgin, nor a woman as the world defined one, but something else, entirely, a sovereign forged by silence, crowned by necessity, and buried by fear. The hours that followed the Queen's death passed in a haze of controlled panic, a choreography of silence directed not by mourners, but by gatekeepers of legacy. For what had been discovered within Elizabeth's body was not only a medical aberration, but a political threat. And those who had seen it understood immediately that the corpse lying before them could not be allowed to become a relic, nor a relic allowed to become an object of study. And thus the burial of the Queen would not be a ritual of remembrance, but an operation of erasure, deliberate, urgent, and absolute. There would be no procession, no royal physicians summoned to give formal statements, no sculptors called to render her death mask as they had for monarchs before her. The body was not laid in state. It was not permitted to rest in any of the great chapels where subjects might look upon it and whisper their own conclusions. Instead, within hours, it was carried by gloved hands down into a chamber, sealed for this purpose alone, where the same three witnesses who had stripped the myth from her flesh would now clothe that truth in chains and lead, not to preserve it, but to bury it forever. The linen in which she was wrapped was soaked with tinctures of herbs and resin, not for sanctity, but to mask the smell of rot and chemical decay that had by now become unbearable, even to those who had seen death many times before. The corset that had embedded itself into her ribcage was not removed, but buried with her, still crusted with dried blood and fragments of skin, for its removal would have destroyed what remained of the body's structure. And so it was allowed to remain like a coffin within a coffin, binding what had once been a woman into a shape that no longer fit, even in death. The casket itself was a marvel of concealment, cast in thick lead and lined with mercury, with no hinges, no seam, no adornment save for a symbol carved into the lid, a sword intersecting a crown, encircled by an Ouroboros, the serpent devouring its tail. No one present could say who had ordered the design, nor what it meant, but none questioned it, for by then the mood in the room had grown so brittle, so breathless, that to speak aloud seemed a profanity against the silence that now ruled the chamber more absolutely than Elizabeth ever had. Before sealing the coffin, Dr. Manningham placed a small vellum scroll inside, Wrapped in oilcloth and tucked beneath the Queen's left shoulder, it bore no royal insignia, no name, only a sentence in Latin, inked in trembling hand. The crown was worn by flesh not born to bear it. Whether this was confession or curse, record or plea, no one knows. For the scroll was never recovered, and the only mention of it survives in the decrypted fragments of Manningham's private writings, discovered centuries later behind a false panel in a Scottish manor. Long abandoned and soaked with mould, the minister, the third witness, offered no scripture over the body. Instead, he knelt in silence and wept, one hand pressed to the lid, not in prayer but in restraint, as if something beneath the metal might still stir if left unguarded. He was never seen again in court. Rumours suggest he fled to the Northern Isles, where he died in a hut facing the sea, leaving behind only a single line scrawled in the back of his Bible. "We buried what should not have lived." Lady Helena Snackenborg entered a convent within a fortnight, swearing a vow of silence so strict she was never recorded speaking again. Her journals, later decrypted by scholars, spoke of what she saw not as a woman, not a queen, but a vessel of paradox, a symbol hollowed by history, wearing flesh like a disguise, crowned by necessity, and sacrificed to silence. As for the palace, it was scrubbed clean with lime and vinegar, the walls repainted, the furniture replaced, and the floorboards beneath the bed were removed entirely and burned in the woods behind Richmond, along with the linens, the instruments, and the basin that had caught the Queen's final breath. The room itself was sealed, and no monarch would ever again reside in that wing of the palace. Over time, the official story hardened into something more palatable. Elizabeth had died peacefully, surrounded by music and prayers, her legacy intact, her body unremarkable, her tomb sealed with honor. But those who had seen what lay beneath the powder and pearls understood that history's brightest myth now rested beneath layers of falsehood so thick they would outlast generations. The truth had been buried, not simply out of fear, but because England itself could not survive the questions it raised. What is a queen? What makes a ruler legitimate? What happens when the symbol upon which a nation is built is revealed to be a mask for something unspeakable? The tomb at Westminster Abbey became a monument not to Elizabeth, but to what could never be acknowledged. It remains the only royal burial in England, never opened, never investigated, never disturbed, despite centuries of curiosity, speculation, and scientific advancement. Ground-penetrating scans revealed anomalies, layers of metal, chains, unnatural voids, but were dismissed by royal historians as structural reinforcements, architectural quirks. Requests to examine the remains were denied under the banner of dignity, though what they sought to protect was not dignity, but stability. Because what if the crown had rested not on the head of a woman, but on something else, something born into neither category, shaped by trauma, molded by poison, and maintained by lies? What if the Virgin Queen had been an illusion not of celibacy, but of identity itself, an impossible being made tolerable only through distance, portraiture, and myth? In the end, the burial was not merely of a monarch, but of an entire possibility that power itself may sometimes wear a human shape, but belong to something inhuman, that what sits upon a throne is not always what it appears to be, and that when history meets horror, silence becomes the strongest seal of all. Elizabeth remains beneath the stone. The lid has not been lifted. The truth has not been spoken. And perhaps that is the most terrifying part, that it worked. Centuries have passed since that March morning when the lifeless body of Elizabeth Tudor was sealed beneath layers of lead and legend. Yet to this day, not a single scalpel has touched her remains. Not a single microscope has analyzed her bones. Not a single strand of her hair has been tested under the sterile light of modern forensic science. For every official request submitted by historians, researchers, and medical scholars has been met with the same impenetrable wall of refusal, framed politely as respect for the deceased, worded carefully in the language of heritage preservation and royal dignity. But pulsing beneath those excuses is a fear far more potent than mere propriety. A fear that the body buried beneath Westminster Abbey may hold truths so corrosive they could rewrite not just the biography of a monarch, but the mythology of a nation. For what rests beneath the stone is not simply a skeleton, but a sealed vault of unanswered questions. A biological archive that could confirm or shatter centuries of belief. And yet the very institutions charged with preserving history have instead become its most zealous protectors from exposure. For if Elizabeth's body were ever to be exhumed, if modern technology were allowed to scan her skull, test her chromosomes, quantify the heavy metals in her bones, or examine the deformities recorded in hushed journals, it would either validate the whispers that have long echoed in the margins of history, or unleash an even deeper abyss of uncertainty. And that possibility has proven too dangerous, too destabilizing, too close to sacrilege for those who would rather keep the tomb sealed and the illusion intact. The efforts to obliterate every trace of her physical reality began the moment her final breath left her lips. And they were not accidental nor disorganized, but methodical, deliberate, and frighteningly effective. All medical notes were collected and burned. All private letters referencing her health were confiscated. And the floorboards where her corrupted blood had spilled were ripped from the palace and incinerated in a forest far from court. The chamber in which she died was never used again. Her bedding destroyed, her garments buried or hidden or erased from inventory. And those few who had seen her naked truth, Manningham, Snarkenborg, the unnamed minister, was silenced, not by threat alone, but by exile, cloister, or mysterious disappearance. Their testimonies scattered in cryptic journals, sealed pages, and fragmented inscriptions that survived only because someone, somewhere, believed that the truth was too terrible to speak, but too important to forget, and so her tomb remains untouched, encased in its double coffin of lead and mercury, bound in chains, marked with symbols whose meanings have been debated for centuries. While all around it the world changes. Technologies advance. Monarchs rise and fall. But no one dares lift the lid, not because they cannot, but because they will not. Because the very idea of unsealing what was so violently buried would be to reopen the wound between myth and flesh, between nation and body, between symbol and the awful, unglamorous truth it was built to hide. And perhaps that is why she remains the only monarch of her era whose remains have never been officially examined, never relocated, never disturbed, as if the ground itself were warning, "Do not look here." For what lies beneath is not for the living to behold, because if what the hidden records suggest is true, if the Virgin Queen was not merely unmarried, but unclassifiable, not simply childless, but biologically anomalous, not only a political enigma, but a physiological impossibility, then every coronation oath she swore, every war she waged, every speech she gave from behind a painted mask becomes something else entirely, not the acts of a glorious sovereign chosen by divine providence, but the performance of a carefully manufactured fiction, crafted by necessity, sustained by ritual, and entombed by terror. And the lie, if it is one, is not small, not limited to her gender or body or legacy, but one that underpins the very identity of England's golden age. For what does it mean if the mother of empire, the slayer of armada, the Gloriana of poets and preachers, was not who they said she was? Perhaps not even fully human in the way history requires her to be. Thus the final deception was not the lead in her makeup, nor the corsets that crushed her frame, nor the theatre of wigs and gowns that paraded her image, while her flesh collapsed in private. The final deception was the burial itself, a burial not of a woman, but of a truth so potent it could not be allowed to breathe. So the tomb became a seal, not against decay, but against revelation, and the silence that followed was not peace, but strategy. The silence that remains is not ignorance, but design. And so the question lingers. Centuries later, untouched, but never gone, what did they bury in Westminster Abbey? A queen, a monster, a miracle of anatomy, a political illusion shaped into skin and crowned in fear? We may never know. Because those who buried her buried more than a body. They buried a reckoning, and they buried it well.